Today's podcast is brought to you by Audible. Get a free audiobook download and a 30-day free trial at www.audibletrial.com/historyfangirl. Over 180,000 titles to choose from for your iPhone, Kindle, Android, or MP3 player. Hi, I'm Stephanie Craig. Welcome to the History Fangirl podcast. This is episode 32, Birmingham and the Civil Rights Movement. The city of Birmingham played a pivotal role in the Civil Rights Movement. Important leaders like Reverend Shuttlesworth and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. pushed the movement to new heights, while the power of the state and local governments, along with the KKK, violently pushed back to keep Jim Crow in place. My guest today is Barry McNealy. He's the Education Programming Consultant of the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. We talk about the unique role Birmingham played in the Civil Rights Movement, the rapid events that happened in the city, and why President Obama, in his last month in office, signed the proclamation turning this important area into the Birmingham Civil Rights National Monument. My guest today is Barry McNealy. He is the Education Programming Consultant at the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute. And I had the extraordinary pleasure of meeting you in September for the anniversary of the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing memorial. And you walked us all through the park across the street and all through the Civil Rights Institute. And I'm so excited to talk to you today. Thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
So before I got to Birmingham, and actually before I got to Alabama in general, the timeline of the civil rights movement, and specifically the things that happened in Birmingham, weren't set in my head. You know, I knew Birmingham is an important place in civil rights history. I didn't know exactly why. And so when I got there, I was overwhelmed with how much information and how much legacy and history is there. I mean, you know, looking at the prison doors that held Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., being in the church, meeting people that were a part of it. It was just all really overwhelming. And a lot of the people that I got to meet were people who were first generation civil rights. They'd been a part of it at the time. But you were actually part of that next generation that's picking up the legacy and making sure that it doesn't get lost. And how did this become your life's work?
When you say that next generation, of course, as I grew up, my aunt was one of the foot soldiers here in Birmingham that was arrested in the park. My high school history teacher was the president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference here in Birmingham, Reverend Calvin Woods. And interestingly enough, as I went to study at Miles College, one of my professors there, Dr. Abraham Woods, was the president of the SCLC during the time that Dr. King was here in Birmingham. So sort of living in Birmingham, just being in the presence of people who were a part of that movement, it just inevitably rubbed off on me.
Now, the corner where the 16th Street Baptist Church is, across the street is the Civil Rights Institute, and then across the street is a national monument. And I'm assuming those two things are there because the church is there. But why don't you tell us a little bit about the layout of this incredibly significant corner in the city?
Well, it previously referred to it as the Civil Rights District here in Birmingham, but since January of last year, after President Barack Obama signed a proclamation, this is now the Birmingham Civil Rights National Monument. And that monument, it's all contiguous. You have Kelly Ingram Park, where the site of the demonstrations in 1963, where you see the dogs and the water hoses employed by Bull Connor. You have the 16th Street Baptist Church that you already mentioned, of course, that has a history that stretches through the history of Birmingham, but most poignantly in September of '63 when it was bombed. Then you have the A.G. Gaston Motel, which was the site of the headquarters for Project C that the Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth and Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King began to work on in 1963 here in Birmingham. And that Project C, of course, was the term for confrontation, where they were going to confront segregation everywhere they could find it in Birmingham. And all of these things are tied together very neatly with the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, right in the center of those things, that provides a interactive display that people can come and tour that tells that history in a chronological fashion.
So you mentioned that the history of the church kind of winds its way through the history of the city. So the city is founded in the 1870s after the end of the Civil War, and the church is founded in like 2 years after that. How does this church become a focal point for the civil rights movement in Birmingham?
Well, earlier on, as you said, just a couple of years after the founding of the city, the church's congregation came together. Once that congregation moved to the location that it is in right now, they used their resources to build a fabulous sanctuary that was very well attended in terms of the things that would happen there. For example, W.E.B. Du Bois spoke there. Mary McLeod Bethune spoke there. The great opera singer Marian Anderson performed there. So, and these things are all decades before the 1960s, where the church becomes relevant to the civil rights movement. So during that time period, the church gained a moniker that it was everybody's church. And so African Americans from throughout the area would gravitate to that church because of that church's prominence. But it should also be mentioned that that prominence was earned because they stepped into a leadership position for the African American community. The first 4-year high school in Birmingham for African Americans. Previously, African Americans could only go to the 10th grade for their public education in Birmingham, but the first 4-year high school was born out of that church for African Americans. The first African American bank in the Birmingham area was born out of that church. So that church had always been a place where progressive African Americans looked to for leadership and resources.
How does Birmingham become this important flashpoint in the civil rights movement? Because I think that's something that I didn't realize was how kind of the confluence of things that are accidental and happenstance, and also things that are very planned and things that are put in motion by, specific leaders making specific decisions. And I guess I just never kind of saw how those things had gone together until you were telling us exactly how things started there. So why don't you share a little bit about what Birmingham was like on the eve of the civil rights movement and how it really decided it was going to be important?
Well, the leadership of the Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth would be key in that position that Birmingham played. When we think about the Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, we have to go back to earlier in Montgomery. When the Montgomery bus boycott started, the state of Alabama eventually is going to target the NAACP because of the relationship with Rosa Parks and her husband Raymond, and their working with the NAACP. So as the state of Alabama targets the NAACP, eventually they're going to outlaw them from functioning legally within the borders of the state of Alabama. That's going to be 1956. Well, in June of 1956, the Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth is going to form an organization to stand in the gap for the NAACP, and that's going to be the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights. And his organization is going to take on the legal tactics of the NAACP, filing case after case after case in Birmingham. But it's also going to take on the nonviolent, direct social change aspect that's going to be employed by the Montgomery Improvement Association during the Montgomery bus boycott. And these things are going to start in 1956. In January of 57, Shuttlesworth and King are going to meet with other civil rights dignitaries, and they're going to form the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And so I mentioned that to say that Birmingham is already having a strong organization in place pushing for the dismantling of segregation. Later, King is going to say, and say quite accurately, that the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights is the strongest affiliate of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And because of that, when Dr. King comes to Birmingham in 62, the two men are going to decide that they're going to combine forces and take on Birmingham. Now, one thing that can't be missed in any of that is Dr. King's campaign in Albany, Georgia, where they're not as successful as they would have liked to have been. In fact, some people characterize the Albany campaign as a defeat for Dr. Martin Luther King. So he comes here to Birmingham after that, and you have this structure in place already. It's, kind of like, how people say we're going to join this program already in progress. Well, the movement is already in progress in Birmingham. And what King doesn't have is he doesn't have the numbers to bring about a mass demonstration after Albany. And what Shuttlesworth doesn't have is he doesn't have the notoriety that King has. And when those two men put those two things together, Birmingham was a natural place for that. And as they progressed through the spring of 63, it gained momentum. And as it gained momentum, it eventually led to Birmingham agreeing to begin to dismantle its legalized segregation.
Now, Shuttlesworth actually invited King to come to Birmingham, correct?
When we say invited, let's understand that King comes to Birmingham in September of 63 after the Albany campaign to a pre-planned Southern Christian Leadership Conference meeting that's going to be held in the Birmingham area.
Okay.
And when he comes here, Shuttlesworth talks to him about Albany and says, well, we've been stumping for you to come to Birmingham for a number of years now. And now is the time. Well, that's September.
So things are already well in motion there?
Yeah, things are already well in motion in Birmingham, but the so-called invitation was given in September. Dr. King doesn't agree to that until December of 62. So it took some cajoling on the part of Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth to get Dr. King to agree to that. But by the time that Dr. King did agree to it, the two men were ready to take on Bull Connor, and it was quite a struggle.
Bull Connor, first of all, that name sounds like a movie villain name. And he more than lived up to that stereotype. Who was Bull Connor, and why was he someone that would inspire people to take action in this way?
When we think of Bull Connor, I'm always interested in his name. His name was Eugene Theophilus Connor.
Which is much less villainous sounding.
Yes, it's much less villainous, and it's pure. When you think of Theophilus, that's the city of the gods, and so you think of this person, but he's a mule politician, and when we say mule politician in Alabama, the heads of the Democratic Party those people that ran the state through its inception, they were called mules. And this politics was wed very, very strongly to the politics of race. And Bull Connor is going to run for office a number of times uh, with this idea of segregation in mind. He's going to get that moniker Bull as he works as a announcer for the baseball field here in Birmingham, Rickwood Field. And he would, have a radio show where he would, call these games. And during the radio show, he would, of course, espouse very awful, racist utterances. And people would, talk about how his voice was, booming and like a bullhorn, hence the term, Bull Connor.
Okay.
But as he takes power in Birmingham as the Commissioner of Public Safety, as early as 1937, we're going to see his puritanical, sort of iron-fisted leadership of the city. It's going to be espoused in so many different ways. For example, there is an ordinance in Birmingham during this time period, Section 597, that said that Negroes and white persons not to play together. And it said that it was unlawful for a white person and a black person to play in any game of cards, dice, dominoes, or checkers. Well, 1947 is going to see the successful integration, or I should say reintegration, of Major League Baseball by Jackie Robinson. Well, as soon as that is done, Bull Connor has Section 597 amended, and it goes from cards, dice, dominoes, and checkers to cards, dice, dominoes, checkers, baseball, softball, football, basketball, or any similar game. So this is just the kind of leadership that you're having here. And, Bull Connor is actually going to have, comic books that are leaning towards integration. He's going to have these comic books and books like that pulled from public consumption and have them burned. And when you think of books burning, you don't think of the United States, but this is the kind of thing that Bull Connor oversaw during his administration.
Well, and even if you do think of the United States, you don't think of like integration literature as being the number one target for someone for a book burning. That's really, I think that's really eye-opening.
Yeah, that this is just it's how committed he was, and then those people that, and the thing that we can't forget is when we start talking about Bull Connor and we start talking about Fred Shuttlesworth, we have a tendency to look at things in a prism of protagonist and antagonist. It's important to remember that these people represented other people. They had a support base behind them. That Bull Connor couldn't have done the things that he did without a sizable contingent of the city of Birmingham allowing him to do so. But the wonderful part of that, of course, is that Fred Shuttlesworth couldn't have done the things that he wanted to do without a sizable part of Birmingham, supporting him. But it's important to remember those things.
Absolutely. And I also think, too, on this podcast, a lot of times, like, history ends up bleeding into, like, conversations a little bit about what's just going on politically now because things are just so off the rails in so many ways. And I think that it's important to look at movements that were evil or movements that were good and remember that it is a lot of people behind it. And so if there's something going on around you now that you do not like, you have to be part of that movement if you want it to change.
Exactly.
So what happens in 1963 in Birmingham? Because 1963 is an incredibly intense year full of lots of different things. I'm sure that historians could write entire books about 1963 in Birmingham. But so King gets there in December. and the bombing happens in September of that year. What does it look like in between those two kind of bookends?
Well, in between those kinds of bookends, the first thing we have to consider is Birmingham is aware of Albany.
Okay.
And with Birmingham being aware of Albany, that's going to give, even though Fred Shuttlesworth does have a contingent of committed support, it's going to be a stumbling block to say, all right, well, we tried these things, and they weren't successful. So now you're asking me, in effect, will I be targeted for physical violence or to lose my job or to put myself in harm's way when the last time you tried these very same tactics is not successful? So the support that they wanted to have is going to be challenged by that reality. One of the things that they're going to do is they're going to have many marches. They're going to have the Palm Sunday March. They're going to have the Good Friday March. Dr. King is going to be arrested, and this is going to be the time where he's going to pen the historic letter from a Birmingham jail. There are going to be a number of things that are going to be done to try to garner and mobilize Birmingham, but the most important thing is going to be when they decide to use the young people in Birmingham. And as young people are brought to bear, you're going to have these thousands of committed, energetic people that are going to be participating, and this is going to overwhelm the city of Birmingham in the spring of '63. Now, Birmingham is going to, on May 10th, after these demonstrations, they're going to begin to see that this is not a way to move forward, and they're going to begin to take down the colored signs and the white signs. They're going to make moves to allow African Americans to hold positions in different places where they weren't before. They're going to make steps forward. But that's not to be confused with success, because there's still quite a ways to go in Birmingham. For example, voting rights are not dealt with at all in terms of the demonstrations. In terms of integrating Birmingham City schools, that's not done as a part of the major demonstrations in '63. So there's a lot of work that's left to be done. And during that time period, Fred Shuttlesworth is going to win a federal court case that's going to order Birmingham to finally relent and integrate its school system. When that order was handed down, the response was the United Klans of America bombing the 16th Street Baptist Church. So there's it's almost like a roller coaster in terms of you start out with this unbelievable task ahead of you, and then you hit this crescendo with the D-Day and Double D-Day in the spring of '63, and Birmingham, relents. The largest segregated city in the United States of America is going to relent, and you feel some optimism, and then the schools are going to be integrated. Then right behind that, you're going to have the tragic bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church. That's going to take the lives of 4 little girls, and 2 little boys are going to be killed that same day as well because of racial violence. So it's I don't want to trivialize it, but it's like an emotional roller coaster that the city went through between that December of '62 and that September of '63.
Now, let's talk a little bit more about what happened at the church and what happened on that day. So, and I think they know now exactly who were the people that decided to bomb the church and what What was it like that day?
Well, um, the September the 15th was an ordinary, beautiful day in Birmingham, Alabama. The kids at the church were excited about a youth performance that they were going to make before their congregation. Um, there were no immediate causes of threats, because if we go back to the idea of, this is September now. So we're on the other end of August 28th when Dr. King has gone to D.C. and has given I Have a Dream speech, and it's part of that emotional roller coaster as well. So things are really, really looking up, so to speak. And the Ku Klux Klan, because of the court case, the night before September 15th, they'd gone to the church and they planted a bomb outside of that church. And that morning, someone called, and Carolyn McKinstry, she goes in and she answers the telephone like she always does. That was her job as a youth there at the church, was to, answer the phone and do things for the pastor. And she answered the phone, and this gravelly voice said, 5 minutes. And as she stepped out to try to tell someone, that's when that blast occurred. And that blast, it took the lives of the 4 little girls instantly. One little girl was a sister of one of the girls, was grievously injured. Her name was Sarah Collins, but she lived. And then there were, a couple of dozen people inside of the sanctuary that received minor injuries. But it was a very stunning moment because of the unexpectedness of it, and then the level of brutality that also went along with it.
Now,
a very dark day.
Yeah. You mentioned that 2 boys were also killed because of racial violence that happened that day. Did it spill out from the church, or was that a separate incident?
Well, they were separate incidents. One little boy, his name was Virgil Lamar Ware, and there was a Klan rally, and at the Klan rally, they told these Ku Klux Klan youth to target, kids and target people, and put them back in their place. This was this idea of place, whereas African Americans weren't supposed to ask for equality. They weren't supposed to want the same thing that other people around them wanted. That was stepping outside of their place. And historically, whenever African Americans stepped outside of that place, there would always be the underlying threat of overwhelming violence. So as these youth left this rally, they happened upon a young man by the name of Virgil Lamar Ware, and they shot him. And when they shot him, they were arrested. These 2 kids were taken into custody, and the kids confessed to shooting him. And when they were brought up after 6 months of juvenile detention, the judge in their case commented that they were decent young men, and he didn't. In fact, he even went so far as to comment that one of them was an Eagle Scout. And at the end of this, he released these 2 youth after serving only 6 months in juvenile detention for the confessed murder of another child. There's another young man. His name was Johnny Robinson, and he and a group of other youth were angry because of what happened at the 16th Street Baptist Church. And the report is they were throwing rocks at cars to vent their frustration. The police were called in, and when the police arrived on the scene, these children, they ran from the police, and as they ran, one of the officers pulled out a shotgun and fired and struck young Robinson in the back and killed him. And the chief of the Birmingham Police Department actually participated in a brief cover-up of the incident. But it does come to light what happened. But even when it comes to light what happened, the chief of the Birmingham Police Department said that the shooting was justified, even though the kid was running away and wasn't armed. The shooting was justified, and the police officer wasn't punished.
Well, that also sounds a little bit too familiar.
It sounds painfully familiar, and this is one of the reasons that the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute exists. Our mission statement is to take the lessons of the civil rights movements and the human rights movement of the past in our present to try to chart a better future. And we can't look at current events without somehow trying to trace a connection between what's going on now and what has gone on in the past. And when we trace that connection, then we have to ask ourselves, well, what have we not learned? And sadly enough, that the answer to that question is a lot longer than you would think it would be.
I think that part of why I do this show and part of, it's really rare for me to take a trip and not cry. It's just like, I cry when I get emotional, like I just do. And, I try to like go places where you can learn lessons like this. And it's, and I want other people to know these stories, but it does, it always shocks me how not as far ahead as we are as we think we should be. And I'm not sure, just for listeners, I recorded an episode about Angkor Wat, but we talked a lot about the Khmer Rouge in that episode. And I think this episode will actually come out before that one. But one of the things that Andrew and I talked about on that episode was how I think 10 years ago I would have thought things were looking really up. And so however far we'd come, we were going to keep going. And I think that it's just such a different time and everything feels so retrenched that it makes it a little bit harder to be as optimistic. but I think it's important to recognize how much work there is to do at the same time.
Well, what I would say to that, Stephanie, is you are a victim of your textbooks. And as a former high school teacher, our textbooks are usually designed where they have this sort of an unconscious progression towards the positive present. And the way they're designed is that there's slavery, but then there's the Civil War, and then there's World War I and World War II, and things just move inexorably forward in this narrative that our textbooks design. The problem with that is that that's not how life is. Instead of things moving inexorably forward, as Dr. King said, that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. But even though it bends towards justice, it's not going straight there. It's a few steps ahead. Then you're going to have some roadblocks. Then you're going to overcome that. And then you're going to have some setbacks. And then you're going to learn from that, and then you're going to move forward. And I think sometimes that we get discouraged when we find ourselves saying, well, how could somebody go to Mother Emanuel Church and do what they did there? Or how can people march with torches, in the night in Charlottesville? How are we still doing these things? But we have to understand that is all a part of our move forward. It is not a smooth progression, and it never has been. It's just that that's how it's kind of laid out in history books. But for us living in reality every day, we just have to take heart that if we remain vigilant and we try to learn from those lessons, eventually we will move, and the needle will move where we can actually perceive that movement. But it's not a smooth progress.
So I completely agree. And also, I think, too, a lot of people who maybe had the luxury because of different privileges or different ways that they grew up, of not knowing how things really were between outside forces forcing them and maybe introspection. It's better to know where things really are and keep going than to be blind about what's really where we really are, like, than to not know. But it still is, it's hard to hear that something that happened 55 years ago sounds exactly like a tragedy that could be in the newspaper tomorrow. And we don't seem any closer to figuring out how to stop it. But we probably are closer, just not as close as we want to be, I guess.
Well, I totally agree with you, and I would say that to a certain degree, what we have to do is we have to make sure we don't take our eyes off of the larger picture. Whereas, I mean, if we're talking about race relations, of course, because we're talking about the Birmingham movement, and if you look in the headlines and you see that there's police violence or excessive use of force, and you look at that and you look at it in 2017, 2018, and you say to yourself, well, this is the same thing that was going on in 1955, and that response is a natural response. It's totally understandable. But if you pull back your lens a little bit and you look and say, well, okay, now in 1955, yeah, police brutality was one thing, and in 2017, 2018, you have a police officer who is misusing his power and abusing his power over citizens. But look at the wider picture of 1955 as compared to 2017, and then we can see the progress. And I'm saying all this to say that a lot of times we see symptoms of, and when we see those symptoms of, we think, oh my God, we're about to get sick again, and we're about to be thrown right back into what we were. But just because there are symptoms of things, it doesn't mean that the overall malady is returning. So we have to be able to look at the bigger picture so that we can chart the progress and not be discouraged by those moves backwards. We can't let Charlotte make us think that we're going back to the days of Bull Connor. That won't happen. That can't happen. Although Charlotte is quite distressing, it is not something that we should be tolerant of, but we shouldn't take it out of its context and make it something that it's not.
So, in the aftermath of September 15th, what does it look like in the city afterwards?
Well, one of the things is that, and understandably, there's a pall that falls over the city. People are really distressed because of what happens here. If you could just imagine the emotional letdown that people had after everything that had been taken place in '63 already. But with the bombing of that church, Dr. King comes to Birmingham again, and he delivers a eulogy for 3 of the little girls who were killed in that church bombing. And in his words, he talks about Birmingham's positive future and the utopian extremes that are possible out of Birmingham. And so what's done there is it's kind of like the phoenix that rises from the ashes. I think that Birmingham, because of what the United Klan of America did, both black and white, Birmingham was able to see the result of that powerful hatred, and they began to pull back from it. And as people begin to pull back from it, more incremental steps were taken. Eventually, Birmingham is going to hire black firefighters and black police officers, and the schools are going to continue to integrate, and things are going to progress, but it's going to take some time.
So after that, how does Birmingham and how do the civil rights leaders in Birmingham view their role in the continuing civil rights movement?
Well, it's important that you said continuing civil rights movement, because when we start talking about the police officers being hired, that's not going to happen in '63. In fact, it's going to be a number of years later, and Fred Shuttlesworth is going to leave Birmingham in '61, but he's going to continue his leadership of the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights from his new home in Cincinnati. So there are many issues in terms of inequality that have to be addressed. For example, there's environmental racism where the sewer system in Birmingham was unhealthy, and it was in places where African Americans lived. It flooded, and all kinds of things would happen. And the city hadn't done anything about these things. And so things like that had to be addressed. As I mentioned, police officers had to be hired. So there are a lot of things that are still left to be done in Birmingham. And then Birmingham is going to connect to the larger movement, of course, because when Dr. King leaves Birmingham and you have the Civil Rights Act signed in '64, as I mentioned a little while ago, that doesn't address voting. So you're still going to have quite a bit of work to be done. The ballot is still going to be something that has to be achieved in Birmingham. It's going to be 1979 before Birmingham has its first African-American mayor, even though the population in Birmingham was not quite 50-50, but it was like 43% African-American as early as, the 1930s. So there's a lot of progression that, although the marches and the demonstrations of '63 were quite impactful, there was still a tremendous work left to be done after those marches and demonstrations were concluded.
Now, we've talked a little bit about how these events have bled or sounded like the present. One of the interesting pieces to come out of the quest for justice in this is when I was there in September, I met Doug Jones because he was at the memorial, and then also we got to meet him in a restaurant. And when we met him, he was the guy running to try to be a senator for Alabama, but I don't think anybody at the time really thought that he was going to end up being a senator from Alabama. And then that race got really crazy and he was elected in December. But he played a role in the quest for justice for the girls. And do you want to just briefly tell us that story? Because I do think it's interesting how that story is still a part of American politics at the end of 2017.
Yeah, certainly. Well, when we look at the initial bombing in 1963, you had individuals arrested initially after the bombing, and they were charged with illegal dynamite possession. Those charges did not stick. The FBI, and this is probably a larger conversation, But the FBI, under the leadership of J. Edgar Hoover, wasn't the best friend, and I'm doing air quotations, so you can't see, but he wasn't the best friend of the movement. So when the church was bombed, the FBI did not cooperate fully with the city of Birmingham to allow for prosecutions of those people that, there's evidence here. And there's a history here. In fact, one of the men who was convicted by Doug Jones attacked Fred Shuttlesworth in 1957 when he tried to integrate Phillips High School. So these people were well known to local authorities. Robert Chambliss, who was the first person brought to trial for these bombings, had a criminal record that went back to the 1940s for assaulting black people. So when we start talking about Thomas Blanton and Bobby Frank Cherry and Robert Chambliss and Herman Cash, these people were very much on the radar. It's just that in 1977, when Bill Baxley, who was at the time the prosecuting attorney in Birmingham, when Bill Baxley brings this case, he's hamstrung with how much evidence he can bring to bear because of that recalcitrance on behalf of the FBI. So 1977, you do have Robert Dynamite Bob, nickname, Chambliss, to be convicted of the murder of Denise McNair, the youngest of the little girls who was killed. And Baxley, of course, wanted to try others, but the evidence just wasn't there. And so when you think about Doug Jones grows up in this city, and you don't grow up in Birmingham, black or white, without being familiar with the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing. And so he grows up with that, and eventually he's going to be the prosecuting attorney who's going to, Dr. King said, justice delayed is justice denied. And I don't usually disagree with Dr. King, but if you have to think about it, the church was bombed in 1963. Doug Jones is not going to be able to bring Thomas Blanton and Bobby Frank Cherry to trial until 2004. That's an entire lifetime.
Yeah.
That had transpired by the time that he was able to bring these men to court. And when he brought them to court, he was able to use some of the FBI evidence that wasn't available to Bill Baxley and convict these two men. And this is just something that kind of brings to a close a very, very painful chapter in Birmingham's history. And because of that, there are a lot of Alabamians and Birminghamians and just Americans, period, who really hold Doug Jones in high regard. It's kind of interesting you mentioned the election. We're nonpartisan, but we had people to, send positive remarks, and congratulatory remarks from places as far away as Germany and England and France. I had friends texting me and, messaging me from as far away as New York and Philadelphia. And, and it was like I was working on Doug Jones's campaign or something. And I'm like, I'm great, but it was really an uplifting thing to see that case was finally brought to a close. And I think that Doug Jones was a pretty powerful person to be able to bring that eventuality to pass.
Was he on the board of the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute?
Well, he was actually the president of our board. He had
Oh.
well, we're nonpartisan here, so I have to make sure that, you don't jump one way or the other, but he was the president of our board, and for him to run for office, he had to resign, and none of us were happy about him resigning, but we felt like he was committed to what he wanted to do, and he got the job done.
I think that even as a nonpartisan institution, if somebody who was the president of your board goes out and does something significant like that, it's people sending you congratulations is a little bit appropriate, even if it's not because of anything you directly did. And that's an interesting anecdote. I thought, well, it was one of those things where, so Dr. Eskew is a historian, and he was on the trip with us, and he introduced us to him, and it was just kind of like, it was like he prosecuted the case, right? He was like, and there's like, oh, also, by the way, he's running for Senate. And it was just such an afterthought. It was so funny. And then for that to be the one political candidate I met in America last year, traveling around, and then it to be somebody who's like literally on the BBC, Al Jazeera news that I'm seeing from Europe was very interesting.
No, I just in terms of anecdotes, I would like to say that I mentioned Carolyn McKinstry earlier, but one of the things that I just am really thrilled about is that we have a program here at the Civil Rights Institute. We call it the Legacy Youth Leadership Program, where we recruit diverse students from all over this county, and we bring them in and we train them to be ambassadors and docents for the museum experience here at the Civil Rights Institute. And these young people, they work really hard to learn this history. But one of the things that I am pleased to say is that Doug Jones never missed an opportunity to come in and impress our young people with how important this narrative is to not just the city, but to our nation. And that, outside of the Senate campaign and the lights and all of that kind of stuff, it really resonated how much of a responsibility he thought that he had to push this forward. And so that's something that I really would like to mention.
So I would have to say that that's something that I completely, I don't know if agree with is the correct term, because I'm just a little bit in awe, because growing up in the United States, I was a teacher. I did Teach for America for 2 years, so I taught in Philly Public Schools, so the school district of Philadelphia. And I feel like Alabama, my best friend is from Alabama. One of my two best friends, if I don't say that, the other one will get mad, is from Alabama. And I never considered going to Alabama from Kansas or Oklahoma as like a place that I really should go on my next trip, right? It's like, let's go to Chicago or let's go to New York. And then after I went to Alabama and I experienced between going to Birmingham and going to Montgomery and going to Selma, I can't believe that I had never been there before. The story seemed so important. There are so many stories that you can hear so close together. Some of the people are telling their story and it's their first person account, and it's important to listen now before that opportunity is gone. Like, I was just overwhelmed by it. And I feel so blessed that I got invited to come, because I can't imagine going back and being as ignorant as I was before I got there. Do you know what I mean? And I really hope that people who are hearing this, who maybe have the opportunity to go, because it didn't change my life, and lots of things changed my life, but it definitely shifted my perspective on a lot of things. And I feel like it is really important that I went, and I really think other people should go. And so it's just the people like you who are doing this work. It's just really important. And thank you so much for doing it.
Well, it's my pleasure. It's really an honor. And in terms of coming to Birmingham, one of our things is that we really are proud of the designation of the National Park Service to have the Birmingham Civil Rights National Monument. And we hope that now that we are a part of the National Park Service, that people will gravitate and take in this history. I often tell people that you don't know what you don't know until you know what you don't know. And, and because you can just have something just like right in front of you, but if you never paid attention to it, it's right there. And like you said a moment ago, those stories and all of those things are here. They're first person, second person. They're here. They're memorialized, and it's worth the nation taking a look at. So, if anyone that hears your podcast is impressed to come visit Birmingham, I think it will be a very, very successful podcast, and I'm glad to be a part of it.
Oh, thank you so much. What was it like when you guys found out you were going to be a national monument?
Jubilation.
That's a really big deal. I think also with the age of the internet, people can find out small stories or smaller places they never heard about before, and then find out how much there really is and how important they are. And it's so much easier, I think, for people to get information about where is really important to go, and they don't need to take a 5th trip to Chicago. Like, they should really go somewhere that's going to change their perspective on the world, and it's maybe way closer than they have any idea. But it's just because information is so much easier to get now. But congratulations on that designation, because I'm sure that also makes things a little bit easier. But also, you guys just have, what you guys have there is really cool, and people should really go see it.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you so much for highlighting it.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming on. And you shared a lot of this with me before, and you did not have to come and share it with me again. So I really appreciate you indulging me.
No, it's not a problem. It's my pleasure.
I want to say thank you again to Barry for coming on the show. It was such a pleasure to meet him in Alabama. I learned so much from him while I was in Birmingham, and I'm just so grateful that he came on the show to share his knowledge and passion with you all as well. I also want to thank Alabama Travel for inviting me to come and see the Alabama Civil Rights Trail in person. If you have the opportunity to go to Alabama, I highly recommend it. Just, being honest, as a white American, I think that traveling to sites that are important in civil rights and Jim Crow was something that I had just neglected. I think I was more passionate about seeing places related to, colonialism or early America, even like Civil War battlefields. I had seen some of them, but this was an area of American history that I thought I was really familiar with because I knew it in the abstract. I knew it from books. But, the whole point of the show is that when you go and you see a place in person, you understand it so much better. And it gets into your bones in a way that maybe it really can't from a book. So if you ever have the opportunity to go, this was an emotional trip. It made me think about the world in new ways. I realized a lot of gaps in my own understanding of what history is really like. And I think it shifted my perspective on what Jim Crow America was really like and the forces that kept Jim Crow in place in important ways. And I just, it was a really good experience for me to go. And so if you have the opportunity to go, especially if you have kids, I would highly recommend it. I know that it's not maybe the shiny place. It's not a trip to Hawaii. It's not a Disney World trip, but I think it's really important that people go. And there's a reason that, it's a national monument. There's a reason that this is one of the last things that President Obama did during his tenure. And so I just really can't express enough how, even though I, as someone who travels all the time and sees historic places on a near daily basis, how powerful of a place this was for me to visit. And so if you have the opportunity, I hope you take it. Some housekeeping. If all goes well, when this episode comes out, I will be towards the end of my Camino. So I'm doing the Camino de Santiago, which is a historic pilgrimage in Spain. I'm walking just the last 100 kilometers. Some people walk for 5 or 6 weeks. I'm just walking for About a week and a half, I'm walking it hopefully a little bit slower so that I can take time and really see some of the little towns and historic sites on the way. So we will keep this housekeeping brief. I'm obviously recording this ahead of time. But if you have not rated and reviewed the show in the podcast app of your choice, today would be a really great day to do that when I get off the Camino. Think how much joy it will bring me to open up the internet and see your lovely new rating and review. Thank you so much for listening.